Okay, so welcome. I have all of you up right in the corner of my screen so I can see, well, not quite all of you at one time, but I can see a bunch of folks up here in the corner of my screen. Just in case you're just joining us and you didn't quite get the memo yet, if you would like to, there's an optional activity coming up that includes the use of your socks. So perhaps you have a balled up pair of socks that you can pull out, or anything else you can catch in one hand. You can bring that along, and I'll tell you about what we're going to do with it, or what I'll invite you to do with it in a moment. So just as we get rolling, you're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat. You can drop in, who you are, where you are, anything you'd like to say hi. And myself and Rachel and Catherine will just do brief introductions as well. But yeah, you can drop your own introduction in the chat if you'd like. So just a couple things as we get rolling, and then we'll turn it over to, I think, Catherine to say a few words and introduce herself. First of all is, whatever we talk about in the next kind of hour and a half that we have together, only you know your own story, right? So some of the things that we say might be helpful, some of the things might not be helpful, right? And you know your own story and your own truth. So take the things that are helpful and you can leave the rest, and that's okay. Also, it's your choice how much to interact in this presentation. You can keep your video on or off. You can try out different little activities that I invite you to try out, or you can just observe, and either way is just fine. We are recording so that we can make this available to other folks perhaps who couldn't be here. And our intention with the recording is just to record myself and Catherine and Rachel if she says anything in the screen, but it's not to record you folks. So we will cut out any bits of your participation. And also, I did just pop up on the website, right on the page where you registered for this this little interaction. I did pop up a handout that includes some of the key points that we're going to go over today, as well as just the resources that we'll talk about at the end. So if for any reason you have to step out before we get to the resources are available for you, and I'll flash them up on the screen here. One thing to maybe note is there's a Survivor to Survivor forum happening on Tuesday, March 15th. That you can register for, and there's links all over the place, but these are put up on the website already, and I will put them in an email for everyone as well, just so you have them accessible. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, and Catherine can introduce herself and also maybe say a few words about why you thought you might want to pull this together. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen actually so we can all see each other.
Yeah, okay. Can everybody hear me? Just want to make sure. Good. I was going to say I'm not on mute as far as I can tell. So my name is Cathryn Marsh. I live in Superior. Our house is standing, but I'm not actually living in it at the moment because of smoke damage. And it's sort of a trauma upon a trauma to realize that the place you feel that should be safe, that's your home, is not safe. And so we don't even have contents packed out yet. So I can't touch anything. And I sort of I'm in a really bad mental space when I'm at my house. So I'm choosing not to be there. So let me just say a few words about how this came to be. But before I get into that though, I really want to say thank you to Daye from the bottom of my heart for really pulling this together. She's been on maternity leave. She has a brand new little incredibly cute baby. And she helped me out when I wrote to her in late January and said, hey, could you do this? I also want to thank Rachel. She's helping us run things today. So from all of us, please accept our sincere appreciation for doing this. Why is Daye doing this? She's from Canada, right? People are probably wondering what the heck is going on here. So in 2017, I took a wilderness first responder class, which is the 80 hours of preparing for medical emergencies in the backcountry. And in 2021, we'd been in the pandemic. I'd had some extra trauma in my life in 2020. I started working with a therapist, really digging into all the trauma in my life, including being in DC on 9/11. And I was starting to unpack all of that. And so it was about June or July of 2021 where I was trying to figure out how to tie these two things together. So my wilderness medical training, and then, this trauma work that I had started. So I started to look for courses that kind of bridged the gap. And strangely enough, I came across mental health wilderness first aid, and it happened to be in Canada. And because of the pandemic, they had gone online. So I reached out and I said, hey, this is a crazy question, but I'm in Colorado. Can I take your course? And I don't know if it was Rachel or Daye that wrote back and said, of course you could take our class. And it was 4 weeks in November, 2.5 hours every week. And I learned all this stuff and I kept thinking, when am I going to use this? It's all great, but I have no idea when I'm going to use it. Well, since the fire, I've been going back to that course over and over and over again. So there are things that we're going to talk about today that we talk about: the lizard brain, the wizard brain. I have probably explained that 50 times since January. All the different ways. This is my cat, by the way, my emotional support animal. How to bring yourself back from that trauma swirl and kind of get grounded. I do that probably 4 or 5 times a day. And then how to hold space for other people and active listening. I thought I was a good listener before I took that class. And then I think part of the realization of everyone in that class is, no, there are really some techniques that you can use to really hold space for someone else. So I am not here to say I'm an expert by any means on mental health, but think of me as someone who has lived through what you've lived through or something similar to what you've lived through. And I have some connections to some resources, and I really want to help you find the resources you need so you can start to feel better. So that's why I'm here. So I will throw it over to Daye, and she's the expert. So she's going to walk us through the rest of the course.
Thanks, Catherine. And yeah, I'm so glad that Catherine, approached us with this, and we're kind of honored and humbled to be here. If maybe I won't speak for Rachel, but I'll speak for myself. But I imagine she shares that sentiment. So yeah, my name is Daye Hagel. I am in Courtenay, British Columbia in Canada, right on the west coast on Vancouver Island, if folks are familiar with that area, perhaps. I'm a clinical counselor. So my background originally was in child and youth mental health, and particularly in something called play therapy for quite young children who've experienced trauma. And then I became an adult clinical counselor as well. So I've worked with all kinds of different populations out here on the west coast. And my own personal project is something called Mental Health Wilderness First Aid, which is the program that Catherine took. So we offer different courses and trainings online to help folks get some basic mental health skills. So I'll turn it over to Rachel for just a brief intro. Who are you, Rachel?
Hello, everyone. I am Rachel. I'm a homeschooling mama to 5. I've got my littlest one with me today as we're just getting over being sick, and it wasn't working out any other way than having her with me. So I also work part-time for Mental Health Wilderness First Aid, and help support Daye put on the courses and do inbox stuff. And it's, it's just something that I keep learning from each time we run the courses too. And so I'm really happy to be here and, learn alongside you all and be of any support.
Thanks, Rachel. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Oh, and I was just going to say one other thing, which is that, it's very nice of Catherine to refer to me as an expert. I have some expertise in some areas, and I have no expertise in, what your life and your situation is like. So you folks are the experts on that. And, I'll offer some things that perhaps would be helpful as well. So I'll go back to sharing my screen here. Everyone can see this? Yeah. Okay. So again, just like we said in the poster, here's our brief agenda for today. So we'll start by talking about how do our brains work when we experience stress and trauma? How do they work for us? And they're trying to protect us. And sometimes it doesn't always seem to make sense how they're working, but it can be helpful to know a little bit about that. We'll talk about some activities that naturally promote healing and resilience. We're going to talk specifically about what we can do to support any children that might be in our lives or around. And also, last but not least, we'll talk about some resources. And I think Catherine will talk mostly about that because she's done a lot of research to pull those things together. But first, I'm going to stop sharing my screen again. And if you'd like to participate, I'm going to invite you to grab your socks or something, anything that you can kind of toss and catch with one hand. So like we said, it's your decision whether you want your video on or off. If you'd like to turn it on, it is kind of nice to have just that little bit of sense of connection during this particular activity, and you'll see why. And if you'd like to keep it off, that's completely fine as well. But we're just going to start. I'm just going to go back a little bit so you can see me. And this is going to maybe seem a little bit silly, okay? And that's okay. And then we'll talk later about why I might have invited you to try this out. So we're just going to take our socks in one hand. And we're just going to see if we can get a toss going. just back and forth. Just a gentle toss. And then I'm going to see, now this might be a little bit easier when we're in a group in the same room because there's not the Zoom delay. Okay, but see if you can just match my toss. Right, so everyone's trying to toss at the same time as me. We'll see if we can kind of get a group pattern going here. Great. Okay. Okay, now we're going to try something else. We're going to try a toss and then just pass it back. It's a little bit different. Toss, pass it back, and try to match me. Good. Got a rhythm. Good. Okay, now we're going to try a toss and around the back. And a toss and around the back. This is great. Okay, toss and around the back. Amazing. Amazing. And go the other way. Toss and around the back. Good. Oh, if you drop your socks, that's okay. Okay, 3 more times. 3, 2. Oh, we're getting good at this. 1. Oh, bonus toss. Nice. Nicely done. Okay, so just before we go on, I turn my PowerPoint back on. We will talk about like why I might have wanted to do something so silly, get you all on Zoom and throwing your socks around. But just take a quick moment to just take a deep breath and just check in with yourself. How does your body feel? How did it feel to do something so silly with a group like this, especially if you have it so you can see other people out on the screen? Just check in a little bit about how that felt. And we will talk about why I asked you to throw your socks around, but I'll just get us to kind of hold on to that experience for a moment. So I'll go back to sharing my screen here. Okay. So we're going to start just by talking about this first topic. So how does our brain work in times of stress and trauma? And one of the things that I really like to say is this line I always come back to in the course that Catherine took, which is our brains are our good friends, and they're always doing the best they can to help us in difficult situations. And they don't always quite get it, what we might think of as right, but there's reasons why they behave the way they do and why they, make us do the things that they do. So here's a little bit of technical information. Okay, I do have a handout that has all the information in it for afterwards, so I don't expect you to remember this stuff. But some people like knowing a little bit more about the technical information of how the brain works, and then we're going to break it down and make it simpler. Okay, but we're going to start with some technical information. So there's 2 basic parts of our brain, and I'm going to invite you to follow along. Okay, and that means right now I'm going to invite you to just touch the back of your head. Okay, so kind of this back part here and going down towards your spinal cord, and then also if you could stick your fingers in your ears. And then kind of touch the middle of your brain. Don't really do that, right? But that's what we call our lizard brain, is that kind of back and inside part. Okay, this is an unconscious part of the brain. It's a very, very old part of the brain. If you think in evolutionary terms, right, we share this part of the brain with all other vertebrate species. And also we have it since we're little babies when we're growing inside of mom, right? That part of our brain is very, very old. What you might call it primitive, but it's an extremely powerful part of the brain. It's very effective at keeping us alive. So this part of the brain is in charge of survival, right? Its job is to look around and pick up on threats, if there's any threats in the environment. And it's also in charge, just in regular times, all of the time, of keeping the body running. So it keeps our heartbeat going, it keeps our digestion going, it runs our endocrine system, so the different hormones, that sort of thing that go floating around in our body, keeps our breathing going, right? And all of these parts of the body, they can be either in a high alert state or kind of a low alert state when we're relaxed, right? But that's the lizard brain's job. It's an unconscious, instinctive part of the brain. We're not consciously in control of our heartbeat, that sort of thing, but it runs these things for us, and it's based on what kind of threat we perceive, how it operates. So there's a second part of the brain. So I'm going to invite you to touch the front of your head, your forehead, especially your forehead, kind of all of the outside of your brain, but especially that forehead. And that's a different part of the brain. It rhymes with lizard, but it's not lizard, it's wizard. Yeah, so that's our wizard brain. Okay, so especially this very front part of the brain, this is a very human part of the brain. We don't share this with other animals. Okay, and the wizard brain's in charge of things like rational decision making, like our consciousness, right? And we don't understand consciousness very well from a psychological perspective. But it's in charge of doing things like making decisions, right? Using rational decision making, thinking clearly, helping us communicate, all that kind of stuff. That's all part of our wizard brain. This is a pretty new part of the brain in evolutionary terms. It hasn't been around for that long. Humans are the animals that have it really well developed. Might help you, focus on things like, oh, where to put my keys, or what did my boss just say, or, what should I do in this situation, whatever it is. So the thing about lizard brain, where is my little lizard? There it is. This is two parts of the brain, right? So even when wizard is out doing its thing, lizard is always kind of scanning the environment in the background because its job is to keep us safe for survival, right? So it's scanning. And as long as it doesn't detect any threat, then we have a nice relaxed lizard, right? And if we have a nice relaxed lizard, then who gets to be in charge of what we're doing? Wizard gets to be in charge, right? And so we find it easier to make kind of rational decisions, to think clearly, to remember things, all that kind of stuff, as long as lizard's relaxed. What can happen though is if lizard's scanning for threat, or if there's some kind of threat that shows up in our environment, and in the class I use this little saber-toothed tiger, right? So the saber-toothed tiger walks into the cave where we're living, suddenly lizard snaps into action, right? And so lizard will do things that put our body into fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? And that'll activate certain parts of our anatomy that kind of help us survive in the situation. We'll talk about what those things are. But what happens is if lizard has to take over to protect us in some kind of survival situation, who has to take a step back? The wizard has to take a step back, right? And so this part of our brain, our neocortex, the part of our brain that's in charge of thinking clearly and rational decision making, all that kind of stuff, it kind of just shuts down. And it can shut down totally, or it can shut down just a little bit, and it might stick around that it's kind of shut down for just a little bit. But the reason is because lizard brain is such a powerful part of our brain that has to, protect us and survive, is that it just takes all of our body brain energy. And so it really takes over. So when it's threatened, it puts us into a fight, flight, freeze mode. And that means that it'll change what happens in our body, right? If there's a tiger that's coming into the cave, then it might choose a fight mode for us, or a flight mode running away from the tiger, or it might choose to freeze. But it'll change, our heartbeat will probably increase, our digestion will probably decrease. Digestion doesn't tend to work as well when we're highly stressed, right? And some people know that because, maybe there's stomach aches that come up when they're stressed, that sort of thing. Breathing tends to increase. We get extra blood flow to our muscles so we can, fight the tiger or run away from the tiger, or whatever it is. So our brain changes the way that we're working, but the important thing is to remember is it's not a conscious decision, right? This is the unconscious part of our brain back here that's in charge of all these things. So it doesn't always make sense. So wizard and lizard brain work together, right? It's not that one's good and one's bad. And, if we could only shut down our lizard brain or whatever like that, it's just we want them to be operating, at the right times. So we get wizard, taking care of us by, doing more complex tasks or making decisions, helping us make decisions, that sort of thing. And lizard's always scanning in the background. And then if there's a threat, right, lizard's going to choose for us how we're going to react. Right. So it might choose to fight, might choose to kind of get more aggressive, move toward whatever the frightening stimulus is or the threatening stimulus, take action to attack it. It might choose a flight response, like run away. It might choose a freeze response. And freeze is something we sometimes just talked about, like a fight or flight response. And now we actually talk about fight or flight or freeze. Right. And so one thing to keep in mind with freeze is that sometimes it looks like the person's relaxed if they're in a freeze state. But what we know about freeze states, if it's a fight, flight, freeze state, is that the person's actually highly stressed. It's just their body's gone into shutdown mode as a way to try to help them survive. Right. So if you think about this in terms of, the tiger walking into the cave, if we use that example, freeze might seem a little bit funny as a survival strategy. But what might be happening in the person's, lizard brain is the lizard might be thinking thinking. Oh man, this tiger just walked into the cave. I can't really run away from the tiger. There's not really a good place to go. I can't really fight against the tiger. I don't have a lot of chance there. I wonder if I just freeze and stay really still, if the tiger might not notice me. That might be what lizards kind of thinking, right? The other thing it might be thinking is like, man, if this tiger is going to eat me, maybe if I just kind of like daydream a little bit, or if I feel like I'm not totally in my body, maybe then it won't be quite so horrible when this tiger eats me, right? So our brains are our good friends, right? They're always doing the best that they can to try to help us in difficult situations. But who's deciding, right? Who's making the decision between fight or flight or freeze? Well, it's this little lizard character, right? And so it's this unconscious part of our brain that we're not totally in control of. When we get into situations of a lot of stress or trauma, we're not always in control of exactly how we're acting, and we're not always making rational decisions that we look back on later. There we go. This is one thing to think about when we do look back on times when we were in, periods of extreme stress or trauma or anything like that. We might look back on our responses and we might think, oh my gosh, that tiger just walked right into the cave. How could I have just lain there, right? Why didn't I get up and fight the tiger? Why didn't I try to run away from the tiger? Whatever it is, right? So we sometimes experience this layer of guilt or shame on top of whatever it is that we actually experienced in the past. When we look back on it with the benefit of our rational brain being a little bit more online, then we might look back on it and feel some guilt or shame or judge ourselves based on how we responded. So another thing to keep in mind with this is that when we're in these situations of extreme stress or extreme trauma, whatever it is, it's not necessarily really us that's making the decision as to how to react, especially physiologically, right? It's our lizard trying to protect us. Lizard brain's deciding. So just, can we bring some gentleness and understanding to when we look back on, oh, I forgot to do this, or, why didn't I bring this, whatever it is. Can we bring some gentleness and understanding to looking back on the decisions that we made when we went through those times? When we think about trauma, so this is after the fact we've experienced trauma. First of all, a traumatic event is just any event that was deeply threatening, right? Any event that was deeply threatening, and it ignites our fight, flight, freeze response, and it feels like quite an overwhelming event, right? So there can be a broad range of what we might experience as trauma. People experience trauma in all kinds of different ways. But a deeply threatening event that ignites and overwhelms our fight, flight, freeze response. And then if we experience what we call trauma after the fact, right? So if we're going through a trauma response or we're exhibiting a trauma response, all it means when I say that is it means that our lizard brain is so powerful when it's trying to protect us, because our brains are our good friends and they try to protect us. It's so powerful that fight, flight, freeze response that we found ourselves in, it becomes kind of sticky. So it sticks around after the event, right? And it lingers. So we're continually, even if, this traumatic event was a day ago, a week ago, a year ago, years ago, whatever it is, for some people and for some reasons, fight, flight, freeze can become sticky. And so I'll talk about like what that could look like, right? Sticky fight, flight, freeze could look like a lot of different things. This is probably the most word heavy slide, right? But so you might recognize some of these things in yourself. You might recognize some of these things in other people. Might have trouble concentrating, trouble remembering things, because those are going to be wizard brain functions, right? And if wizard brain's not totally online because your lizard is sticky, then you might have trouble with the wizard brain functions. Eating or sleeping changes, right? Because those are things that lizard brain's in charge of, those physiological things. And so if lizard's a bit dysregulated, right, then that could change. One of the things, remember, that we talked about with lizard being in fight, flight, or freeze is that it tends to shut down our digestive system in our body. And that's because the body needs that energy to go to somewhere else, like to running away from the tiger or fighting the tiger or whatever it is. So digestive symptoms are pretty common. Might have intrusive thoughts, might have flashback memories, might have nightmares. This is something we're going to talk about when we talk about children as well. We might find ourselves particularly sensitive to certain sounds or smells or colors. Right? And one of the reasons that we can think about that is that lizard brain has imprinted all of the information that happened during that event, because it's like, this was really traumatic. I want to gather as much information about this as possible so I can protect myself in the future. And so it can gather that information, but then it makes us sometimes hypersensitive to a certain smell or to a certain color or a certain sound on the radio or whatever it is, right? So we can have these reignitings of our fight, flight, freeze system. We might find ourselves jumpy for the same reason. The other thing we might find ourselves is numb, right? Or less sensitive to certain sounds, smells, or colors. And that might be lizard just getting us into a little bit of sticky freeze, right? Sticky freeze or sticky shutdown. Anxiety, panic attacks, guilt, shame, uncontrollable crying spells. Might find ourselves extra irritable, feeling angry, having angry outbursts. That might be some sticky fight, right? Or avoidance. We might want to avoid people, avoid places, avoid reminders. Lots of things that we might avoid. Maybe lizards trying to protect us, right? So sticky fight, flight, freeze for trauma. Everyone experiences trauma individually, right? Just because two people experience the same incident doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to respond in the same way, or that, you know, one person might experience trauma, one person might feel like, you know, they actually don't have sticky fight, flight, freeze. We can't always predict it. It doesn't always seem to make sense. Sometimes people come to me in my clinic and they're like, you know, I don't understand why this is affecting me the way that it is. I'm a really high functioning person or whatever it is, right? And so it's not always predictable. It's not a competition. Just because, you know, one person lost their house and another person didn't doesn't necessarily mean that they've experienced that trauma in different ways or the same way. They may both be traumatized. They may not, neither of them be traumatized. And then one thing that Kathryn helped remind me of is just that, you know, when we've experienced a trauma, just everything else is still happening in our lives, right? So just because this one big thing happened, it's like, well, I still also have different family relationships that are also going on, and maybe they're also complicated. I also have different work relationships that might be going on. Some of them might have been tough already, and now this is piling on top. So things can layer on top and things can get complicated. One thing that we talk about clinically is something called complex trauma, right? And so there can be different layers of these things that happen. One question that comes up sometimes is this idea of, you know, feeling better, and when will I feel better? How long is it going to take to feel better? How long is it going to take for fight, flight, freeze to not be quite as sticky? Right? And that's a really good question. I think a lot of folks can probably resonate with that. So healing after trauma can take longer than anybody wants it to. And that's something that I reminded myself of when I've gone through my own traumas, right? It can take longer than anybody wants it to. This is a story that I have found really helpful in my own personal life as well as in my clinical practice. So I'm going to read it to you folks. It's a story about an old woman and a pot. Once upon a time, there was a woman whose heart was heavy. She went to seek out the counsel of a wise woman who lived in a cabin in the woods, looking for a remedy that could help ease her pain. The wise woman listened to her story and instructed her in how to brew a remedy for her heart. So she wearily went out into the woods and the gardens around the cabin, and she sought out each plant and herb and prepared them carefully over the next few days, drying some and soaking others, and combining each in certain amounts and at the right time. When she was ready, she returned to the wise woman of the woods with everything she had created in a large pot. Together they warmed the pot on the stove until it was bubbling. Now what? Asked the woman with a heavy heart. Now you stir the pot, answered the wise woman. So the other took up a large wooden spoon and started to stir the pot. When will it be ready? She asked, eager to taste the remedy. You must stir the pot for a year and a day, said the wise woman. A year and a day, cried the woman, despairing. Haven't I done all that the recipe required? Haven't I collected all the right plants, prepared them carefully in the correct amounts, and brought them here? Surely there's something that I can do to hasten this recipe. Could I stir it faster? You are doing everything properly, dear one, said the wise woman. Now you must simply stir the pot for a year and a day. There is no way to hurry the remedy. I found this story helpful for myself. It can take a lot longer than anybody wants it to. And there's also some things that we can do along the way to kind of help while we're stirring the pot. So we'll talk a little bit about different activities that are healing for when we find ourselves in kind of a sticky fight, flight, freeze situation, right? Because there are some things that we can do while we're stirring the pot to help with that. One thing is just understanding our natural brain and body responses, right? So we've already talked about the wizard brain and the lizard brain. And so just understanding how our brains work during times of stress and trauma can be helpful. One of my favorite books, which we talk about again in the course that I took or Catherine took with me, is a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Okay, Catherine ordered it, I think yesterday, and it's already arrived. Hey, whew.
If anyone wants to borrow it, you can borrow it from me.
Nice. And we'll talk about, there's a few different kind of recommended reading if you are the kind of person who really likes books. They'll be at the end. But this book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the kind of theory behind this person's take on trauma is they watched animals of prey for a long time, right? They're trauma therapists and they also watch animals of prey. And what they observed is that, zebras are under attack from animals that are predatory all the time, right? They're always being chased by different animals. They're always kind of under threat. Sometimes they get chased and then for whatever reason they get away, right? And so what they did is they watched what happens when a zebra gets away from a lion, what happens when a zebra gets away from a cheetah, and they survive, but they've experienced this trauma, right? And what they noticed is that the zebras, after they've gotten away, and maybe sometimes there's a little bit of time that goes by, maybe sometimes it happens right away, but their bodies will tremble and their bodies will shake, right? And so sometimes it's just a subtle shake and sometimes it's their whole body will shake. And this person's theory is that that's a natural way that, there's a tremendous amount of energy that goes into lizard brain activity, that goes into putting us into fight or flight or freeze mode, because it's a survival strategy, right? It's like all the energy our body has goes into helping us survive. That's a tremendous amount of energy. And so in the aftermath of that, it takes a while for that nervous system energy to come out, but it also is helped by this shaking that the animal naturally does. And sometimes we as humans experience this kind of thing as well, right? We might find ourselves trembly or shaky, or we might have other lizard brain responses that are going on that are kind of sticky, right? And it's like, this is normal. This is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, is one of the things that I like to say. You can actually, I'll invite you to repeat after me, actually, with this one. You can keep your mics off, but this is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. Right? This is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. Whatever's going on for me physiologically right now, whatever I've noticed about myself that's changed, this is normal, right? And if there are times where you do find yourself feeling a bit trembly, right? Or full body trembly, or perhaps, you can just help your body get rid of some of that activity, some of that nervous system activity that's coursing through our body for that year and a day. We might shake it out, right? That might be one thing that can help. This is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. It might also be helpful to just honor the fact that you might need to go offline, right? And I might mean that literally, I might mean that figuratively, but going offline and just allowing yourself extra time and space and quiet, and honoring the fact that maybe wizard brain isn't in full form right now. Maybe it hasn't been for a little bit, right? Allow yourself the understanding to not get things done in quite the way that you used to. Maybe things need a bit of extra time, or maybe things just need to kind of stop for a while, and maybe you can put up some boundaries around that. Another thing that can help is, this is something that we know about the lizard brain. Part of the lizard brain is called the limbic system. And the limbic system responds to rhythm, right? This kind of back and inside part of our brain, it responds to rhythm, it responds to repetition, and it responds to relationship. And so the part of the brain that's impacted the most by fight, flight, freeze, that part that initiates the fight, flight, freeze response, it will regulate, especially if it's going through something sticky, right? And it's going through sticky fight, flight, freeze. It will help to regulate this part of the brain to do activities that have rhythm, that have repetition, and especially activities that also have relationship. So what are some examples? What are some things that folks naturally do that they like doing? Oh, Catherine's waving her socks. Right. So are there some activities that we naturally do, like going for a walk, right? Very simple activities, because this is a relatively simple part of the brain. But we know that activities that are rhythmic, repetitive, and relational are healing for this part of the brain. So going for a walk, right? That's a natural activity that's rhythmic, repetitive, and relational. It does not mean that all your problems are solved, right? What it means is that that kind of activity will naturally help to regulate the lizard brain and naturally help for some of that fight, flight, freeze to get less sticky. Throwing our socks around. These can be activities that we kind of do more artificially, right? But there's still, if we're going to do something that's rhythmic, repetitive, and relational, especially if we can see all of us up on our screen, we have this little bit of sense of connection. Everyone else is trying to get in the same rhythm, the same repetition, right? These things are naturally regulating for the part of the brain that has sticky fight, flight, freeze. We can also return to the breath. I don't know if anybody noticed, but I was throwing in some deep breaths while we were doing our little sock throwing activity, right? And sometimes when we experience stress or trauma, it's almost as if we're holding our breath for a long time, right? We might feel like we haven't really taken a deep breath all day or for months. Right? So just returning to the breath, that nice deep breath. Other things that are naturally kind of healing and regulating for the limbic brain are other things that are rhythmic, repetitive, and relational. Going skiing, going skateboarding. Skateboarding is really good for young people, right? And so if there's young people in your life who are into that, so like, you know, you can see that potentially through a resilience-based lens, right? That can be something that's naturally healing for their brains. Swimming, paddleboarding, biking, some of these, you know, may or may not be options for you now or ever. But if there are activities that you can include, these are naturally healing. We can also try other things. Some people like some of these activities, some people don't, right? So take the ones that are useful for you. Some people like recitation, right? Especially folks who maybe have a connection with a faith community or a spiritual background, like recitation and prayer, right? Some folks like to recite the rosary. That's an example of an activity that's rhythmic, repetitive, and especially if you're doing it with someone else, it's relational. Even if there's no one, you know, in the room with you, if you have that kind of faith connection, then that might be relational to a higher power, right? So activities that are rhythmic, repetitive, and relational. Math. Shall we try a math intervention? Oh boy, Catherine doesn't like this one. That's okay. You don't have to. But okay, so here's what I'll invite us to do, because some people really like the math ones and some people really don't, and either one is okay. But I will invite you to unmute yourself just for a moment. Everybody can unmute themselves if they would like. And we're going to try out a little math game that's rhythmic, repetitive, and relational. Okay, and actually I'll share my screen again for a moment because what we're going to do is start at 100 and we're going to count backward by threes. Okay, and the first few are right here on the board for you. Okay, and then we'll keep going.
It's like a test.
Yeah, it's like a test. Oh no. Yeah, no, this is your choice if you want to participate in this, but I encourage you to give it a shot. Okay. 100, 97, 94, 91, 88, 85, 82, 79, 76, 73, 70. Okay, should we go all the way down to 0? You're feeling okay? Okay, you can mute yourself again. So for some people that, you know, makes them feel worse. They're like, no, now I'm more in fight, flight, freeze. Like that wasn't helpful at all. So that's okay if that's you. But there's all kinds of different options for activities that are rhythmic and repetitive and relational, and that can be naturally grounding for when our lizard brains have just been like in overdrive for a long time. Right? Playing catch, like we did with our socks. There's also something called tapping, and tapping is wonderful. So I'll actually spend a couple of slides on it. So tapping is a wonderful way to help regulate the nervous system energy in our body, right? Remember, if we're thinking about trauma as nervous system energy, it starts in the brain, but it affects our entire body in terms of how our heart's beating, what kind of stress hormones we have coursing through our body, what kind of breath we have and where it's sitting in our body, how our digestive system's working, all that kind of stuff. And remember the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers? The theory behind this is that, you know, zebras don't get ulcers. They don't have these kind of long-term stress things happening, even though they do experience trauma. The reason for that is because they help their body release that nervous system energy by helping it just shake out. Right. So one simple thing we can do for tapping is just while we're sitting, one place I like to tap is right on the edge of my collarbone. And so when I find myself feeling like I need to ground, just a nice deep breath. And you can try it out yourself. Right. Rhythmic, repetitive, and I can see all of you up on my screen even as I'm doing the slides, so that's nice. So that's relational. Nice deep breath. Another place I like to tap is the top of my sternum. That might feel better. One question that I get asked is, how fast should I tap? Right? Sometimes when I feel anxious, I find myself tapping really fast. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I could slow this down. Something to kind of think about is this part of the brain, our lizard part of the brain, right? The wizard part is not formed when we're little babies and when we're inside mom, but we do have a lizard brain that forms because we're real good at survival and we're real good at fight, flight, freeze. And if you're anything like my baby, then you're real good at screaming sometimes, right? And so we do have a lizard brain. And one thing that lizard brain attunes to is that rhythm. What's the very first rhythm that our lizard brain hears that it attunes to? Anyone have a guess? Yeah,
Yep.
heartbeat. So it'll hear mom's heartbeat, right? And so an average kind of heartbeat at rest is about once a second, maybe a little bit faster. And we know that about once a second, that's a rhythm that's really powerful at regulating our nervous system. So sometimes I like to say, tap once a second. And it's really easy for me to tap faster than that. Another place that people sometimes like, and I don't necessarily know why, but some people like to tap right on the outside of their eye. Nice deep breath. About once a second. If you're anything like me, you might want to go a little bit faster. Oh, and Shannon's showing us that there's a bunch of different places that you can tap around your face and your body. And yeah, one thing that people sometimes like to do is give themselves a little bit of a butterfly hug. Deep breath. Tap on both sides. Yeah. Oh, and it kind of really warms my heart just to see everyone's little videos doing this together. That's great. So that kind of side-by-side tapping or that side-by-side rubbing, any kind of touch is going to help our nervous system with some of that energy. There's another kind of tapping that I really quite like. And I think I'm going to show us a little video. So this is a video that I actually made in about April 2020. So it was just about the time that I had to start really working from home and figuring out some ways to work. And I was especially working with children at this time. And I was like, okay, how can I, reach children particularly? So I made this little video about tapping with my puppet Chims. Chims is the New Channel word for bear out here on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So anyway, it's about tapping. It's a little bit quiet, but this is kind of a more whole body kind of tapping that might be more similar to, when the zebras do their little bit of shaking and they help their nervous system energy dissipate. This is a little bit more similar to that. So I'll invite you to follow along. You can do it from sitting. I'm going to stand because standing can feel even better if you're into it. Oh, oops. Don't want it to go quiet yet. It's a little bit of a quiet video, but the most important thing is just following along with the motions anyway. So if you'd like to stand up, you're welcome to. If you can do it from sitting down, or you can just watch, that's fine. I'm gonna unplug this. So one other thing I really like to do when I feel stressed or worried is I like to do something called tapping. And so tapping can be pretty simple, but I'm just gonna help myself kind of get rid of some of the energy that's in my body from when I feel stressed. And so the first thing I'm going to do with tapping is I'm just going to start on one shoulder and we're going to tap all the way down the arm. So you want to do it with me, Chims? Okay. Give it a shot. Okay, so we're going to tap all the way down the arm. Do our big exhales. Yeah, all the way down to my fingers. Nice, very good. And then underneath, I start going down the other way. My big exhales and then right into my armpit. Make sure I get the armpit. That's a really good place to relieve stress, is those big armpit wiggles. And then, I like to wiggle my whole body and let some of that stress out. That's really good. Okay, now we're going to do the other arm. Ready? Okay, so all the way down this shoulder. Big exhale. Nice job, Chims. And then underneath. Right into this armpit. Feels really good to tap right there. That's a good spot for releasing stress. And then
shake that all up. It's really good. Okay. And the next spots I like to do are just on my back where my kidneys are. So see if your paws can reach. I'm going to go right in the back, right there. And nice taps again. Nice big exhales. And we're going to go down our thighs. You can see me if I back up. Yeah, there you go. So right down the thighs. Right up the thighs. And then right to the back again. Yeah, and then shake that out. Good. And then shims, if you can get your neck, we're gonna go right in the back of our neck. That's a really good one. Oh, nice job, shims. Okay, and all the way up to our head. Big exhale again. Let some of that stress out. And then you can go back down. Give yourself some nice shakes and shake our arms out. Yeah, it's really nice. So that's something that I really like to do, and you can take that back to your cave chims and share that with your bear family too.
Thank you, Daye.
You're welcome. And that's something that we can all do when we feel stressed out, just to kind of help release a little bit more. So
Okay. Whew. I'll just stop sharing for just a moment. So again, I'll just invite you to kind of take a deep breath and just check in with yourself. How does that feel? How does your body feel? Maybe how does it feel when you do those movements? How does it feel when you take a deep breath? How does it feel to see other people on the screen? You might notice things shift in your body. You might notice that a resistance, like you don't want to, be doing these kinds of things. And so whatever it is that you notice, the hope is that you can just get a little bit more in tune with how your body is actually responding to these things. Right? But relational, rhythmic, repetitive activities are naturally regulating for the part of our brain that gets into this sticky fight, sticky flight, or sticky freeze mode after a trauma. And there's all kinds of different ways you can do that. They're particularly fun to do with friends or family, or maybe you have children in your life and they can really resonate with those too. But you can also do them on your own. The other thing about helping regulate the lizard brain is social connection. And so one of the things that we say all the time in trauma healing is connection is the correction. If there's places, people, groups, new, obviously a lot of these, perhaps a lot of these connections might be new, but you might reach out for new connections. You can also connect with yourself and your own experience just by journaling, right? I think we have a lot of resources that we're going to pop up at the end about ways of connecting to community groups, just checking in with friends and family, right? Even if it's the same old, like, hey, how are you doing? Oh, I'm hanging in there. It's just continuing to connect in ways that can be powerful for the lizard brain. Lizard brain likes to connect socially. That's one of the ways that it regulates and grounds, right? We're kind of hardwired to be in community with each other. So continuing to check in, even if we can't solve problems, in the way that we might like to. Maybe I'll pause just there if anyone has any quick questions, and then we're going to talk particularly about supporting children and resources as well. Or is there anything in the chat? I haven't been able to keep an eye on the chat. Is there anything, Rachel or Catherine, that you think we should chat about in the chat?
We've just had some good suggestions for rhythmic, repetitive things. So just more like as you were talking, people adding things in.
Great. Oh, shoveling snow. I love it. Yes. Paddleboarding. Yeah. Wonderful. Oh, for the next few slides, I'll be talking particularly about young little ones. But the thing about working with children, so when I was a clinical counselor for a long time, and I worked with children who experienced trauma and grief, and then they asked if I'd like to consider working with adults. And I was like, whew, I don't know about that. My specialty is working with children, and adults are kind of scary. And someone said to me, well, adults are kind of just big children in some ways, and a lot of the things are transferable. So you might recognize yourself in some of the things that we talk about with children, or you might recognize your own adult children in some of the things. And sometimes it's just interesting to kind of know how our brains work from that young developmental stage too. Yeah. I know something that helped me was chainsawing. Was getting out there and just helping my dad buck up a big tree that fell on his property. Yeah, regulating. Any other thoughts before we talk about children? Okay, keep popping things in the chat. That's great. And maybe Rachel or Catherine can kind of interrupt me or draw my attention to anything in the chat that we should chat about, because it's great to have some participation. Okay, let's talk about children particularly. So how can we how can we particularly support children? So all the things that we talked about, could be applied to children as well. One thing just to be aware of is that children can be affected by traumatic experiences, even if they're too little to remember, right? And one of the reasons for that is because, the part of the brain that has conscious memories of things, that's the wizard brain, right? And the part of the brain that experiences trauma and reacts to trauma and gets us into fight, flight, freeze mode, right? That's our lizard brain. And so lizard brain can be affected, even if we're not totally there yet developmentally to be able to remember things consciously. Right, so children can experience fight, flight, freeze mode, and children also have resilience, right? So these two things are true at the same time. So just noticing and being aware that children can be affected. So in addition to just being aware of trauma symptoms in general, because anything that's kind of sticky fight, flight, freeze could be true for a child, just like it could be for an adult. But in addition to those things, children's trauma can show up in some particular ways. So sometimes there's trouble concentrating at school. That's not uncommon, right? Because maybe if they've experienced trauma, maybe wizard brain just isn't fully operational in the way that it could be or the way that it used to be. So sometimes there's trouble at school, trouble concentrating at school. There may be an increase in anxiety, clinginess, perhaps clinginess to you as a caretaker, might be increase in aggression. That can be a sign of, sticky fight, perhaps, and that fight getting channeled into new directions. Might be nightmares. That's not uncommon for children to experience their anxiety or to experience the trauma or to kind of relive aspects through nightmares or in a symbolic form. Another thing that can come up with children is what we call regressive behavior. And so regressive behavior is, they've reached a certain developmental stage. Maybe they've been potty trained for quite a while, maybe a couple of years. Maybe they start wetting the bed at night, which they haven't done for a long time, right? Or maybe they start needing to wear diapers during the day and they haven't needed to do that for a long time. Or maybe they kind of forget how to do something that they learned before. We'll also talk more about regressive play in a moment here. Sometimes we miss trauma in children. So sometimes we miss noticing, like, oh, this particular child has experienced a trauma, and maybe that's what's behind why they're behaving in this way, especially if there's been a change in behavior. One of the things to be aware of is that sometimes the symptoms of trauma can look like other mental health issues, especially for children. And so sometimes trauma is missed because it can look like ADHD, it can look like ADD, right? It can look like a learning disorder, right? If they're having trouble focusing or having trouble with their reading or their math or whatever it is, that could potentially be a symptom of trauma, and not necessarily, saying it is or it isn't, but you can talk to whoever is your child's mental health care person, or maybe their teacher, or whoever it is that's in their life. And maybe, if there's something coming up like, oh, little Johnny's like not doing so well in his reading, it's like, oh, maybe there could be a conversation about, were you aware that little Johnny experienced this particular trauma? And maybe that's partly what's going on for his brain as well. Maybe it's not necessarily an organic learning disorder, right? Can look like deliberate defiance, right? And that's maybe part of the sticky fight. Can look like other mental health issues. So just something to be aware of with children. Sometimes we miss the fact that they've been through something pretty big, especially if we don't think that they could have been affected by it because they couldn't have remembered it because they were too little when it happened, right? That's an easy way to miss trauma with children. Children do have inner resilience as well, right? And grown-ups can help them process their experiences, and they can help them tap into that inner resilience. So we'll talk about a couple of ways to help children who have experienced trauma. One is just to set an example. Right? Set an example by, you can give voice to what it is that you've been through as well. And there's value in wanting to be strong for our children. And there's also value in letting your children know that, it's okay to talk about our feelings. It's okay to talk about the fact that, mom doesn't feel so well today. Mom's feeling kind of angry. And I think it's sad because I haven't, finished healing from all of the things that have been happening, right? And so we can talk about our own feelings and just model that for children. We can teach children about their lizard brain and their wizard brain. And that's one of the most powerful things that I would do to help young children as well. You're going to, maybe make your language a little bit simpler and that sort of thing. But hey, did you know that we have two parts of our brain, right? We have our lizard brain back here, and the lizard brain's job is to protect us, right? And so it might make us angry if it feels like there's a threat, or it might make us feel small and we want to like go hide in a cave. And then there's our wizard brain, and wizard brain's really good at thinking and helping you do your math and your reading and that sort of thing. And we have these parts of the brain that activate at different times. And so, lizard brain had to do a lot of work in the last couple of months because, we were really going through something quite scary. And so our wizard just took a little bit of a step back, right? But lizard's there to protect us. And right now, lizard's still trying to protect us, even though now we're in a safe place, or whatever your situation is, right? So that's good. We need to say thank you to lizard. And then we can also help lizard just to relax a little bit, right? So we can use language like that, but kids like knowing a little bit about their brain. We're also going to support play, and I'm going to have a couple more slides about play because it's so important for children to play. Children have this natural healing language, the natural communication language with play, and we can encourage relational, rhythmic, and repetitive activities with children just like we can with grown-ups. And then last but not least, we can help children look for the helpers. And some of you might be familiar with Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, saying this kind of thing, right? If there's something terrible that happens, then it can be terrible, and we can also help children look for the helpers. So I'll show you that little clip too, because that's a good one. But let's talk just a little bit more about play. So children have this wonderful innate inbuilt ability to play, and it's the language of children. It's how they process experiences. It's how they understand new things. They try to explore new things through play, and it's also a wonderful way that children can heal. And they especially like repetitive play, right? You might have noticed they want to do the same thing over and over and over again. Or sometimes if they're watching movies, they might want to, watch the same movie over and over and over again. Actually, before I go on to that, does anyone have a kid in their life, or do you remember when you were a kid, you wanted to watch the same movie over and over and over again? For me, it was The Lion King. I had The Lion King memorized, right? But so repetition is important for children because their brains are trying to, make sense of something new or process an experience. One thing that can happen with children who've experienced trauma is that their play can change, and their play can include themes that can be quite serious, right? So we might notice that our children's play will change. It might include themes of danger, of despair, right? They might take on this role of feeling in despair, hiding or running, and children naturally play with kind of hiding and running games anyway. But if they've been part of an evacuation, for instance, they might amp up what that hiding or running looks like for them in their play. Might include themes of being rescued or rescuing. They might want to play someone who is a rescuer or someone who needs rescuing. Sometimes children play on their own and they're a little bit more isolated in their play, and sometimes they want to draw you into their play. And so they might put you in a role, right? Hey, mommy, I'm going to come and rescue you, right? Or will you come and rescue me? Or mommy, you go hide over there and I'm going to try to find you, right? So sometimes children pull us into their play, and that's a relational activity, right? And so play is naturally healing for children, and if it's a relational activity, that can also be part of their healing too. Superheroes, supervillains, those are kind of themes in our society that we naturally have around some of these themes of danger and being rescued and rescuing. Might include themes of death, resurrection, or death and burial. They might act out. They might act out deaths, or act out funerals, or whatever it is. They may exhibit as well, again, something called regressive play. So regressive play is, again, going back to an earlier developmental stage. So maybe games or activities or behaviors that they had when they were little, games they played when they were little. They may also want to play baby, and I've seen children want to play baby when they've experienced trauma quite a bit, right? They may want to, again, they may want to pull you into their play. They may be like, oh, mom, I just want you to rock me or hold me. I've had little children who, were children and were far beyond wanting to use a pacifier, but they did want to use a pacifier in a particular context, right? So they wanted to pretend they were a baby. They wanted me to cuddle them or help them get ready for bed or whatever it is, right? So sometimes things like that happen, that children will regress. And that can be naturally healing as well. One of the ways to think about it is that, when we're little babies, we're really cared for, right? And if we have, caregivers who are attentive, we're really cared for, and we're also kept very safe, right? And so that can be one way that their little brains are saying like, whoa, this was really scary. I want to be back in that stage where I was really cared for and I was really safe because this was really scary. And so they might just need a little bit of extra of that from you. So as long as children aren't really hurting anyone with their play, even if it has serious themes in it, like, themes of death, themes of danger, that sort of thing, even that kind of play can be quite healing for children. So just knowing, like noticing it, and then also being able to see it through a healthy lens. If you are concerned about your child's play, that can be okay too. Your own child best. I don't know what it's like in Colorado, and I didn't have time to research it, so my apologies. Catherine might be able to speak to it more. But there are counselors who specialize in something called expressive play therapy. And so I'm one of them, right? I'm trained to work particularly with very young children, sometimes children who are pre-verbal, because play is such a wonderful, natural, healing language of children that can be an option. So we can encourage children to play, we can play with them, help them to explore themes, let them explore themes kind of naturally. We can also try these relational, rhythmic, and repetitive activities with children, right? So basically anything on that list of relational, rhythmic, repetitive activities that we had with adults, but just encouraging play dates in general, right? If you have an option to encourage play dates, you might change location, you might get outside, right? Whatever your particular situation is. Rocking and patting, right? How perfect is that as the probably the simplest relational, rhythmic, repetitive activity? If we just hold our children and we just rock them and maybe we tap them or pat them, right? That's a really simple activity. Singing, music, drumming, dancing, all of these things are naturally relational, rhythmic, and repetitive. And so they're naturally helping that lizard brain just get a little bit less sticky. Walking, paddling, biking, tapping, tossing your socks around, right? Lots of different options. I think the next slide is talking about looking for helpers. It is. So just before we go into looking for helpers, any thoughts on that? Oh, Encanto is in the chat. Yes. The repetitiveness of Encanto. Absolutely. Anyone else have ideas that maybe you've noticed for your children, or other thoughts or suggestions for children, especially relational, rhythmic, repetitive things? It's okay if not, but you can drop them in the chat. I just like to pause if there's questions once in a while. Okay, nice deep breath, and then we'll see what, I think we're getting down to the kind of the last sections here. So one other thing that we can offer for children is helping them look for the helpers, right? So this is one of my favorite quotes from Fred Rogers. So I'll just let him explain it in his own words, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail about what it might mean for our situations here.
When I was a boy and I would hear about something scary, somebody getting badly hurt or something like that, I'd ask my parents or my grandparents about it. And they would usually tell me how they felt about it. In fact, my mother would try to find out who was helping the person who got hurt. Always look for the people who are helping, she'd tell us. You'll always find somebody who's trying to help. So even today, when I read the newspaper and see the news on television, I look for the people who are trying to help.
So helping children look for the helpers. First of all, we really want to honor two things at the same time, right? And they can both be true at the same time. So we want to honor the fact that this was a terrible, scary event, right? And we can also honor, there were people who were trying to help, and can we help them acknowledge that, this was terrible and scary, and also help them direct their attention to, and, who was it who was trying to help? Let's actively look for those people. Two things can be true at the same time. So by telling children or helping children to look for the helpers, it's not that we're trying to like push down the feelings of anger or anxiety or anything like that. It's just two things can be true at the same time. So one of these pictures is a picture of a child's drawing of a house or a building, pardon me, that was on fire. So I'm going to make it larger, just so you have a heads up about that. So there it is. So this is just an example that might be helpful, right? So sometimes children draw out things that have happened. And again, some of that can be disturbing, right? And as long as they're not hurting anyone, this is probably part of their play circuit. That's a way that they process things in a healthy way. So if I were working with a child who drew a picture like this, right, then I can reflect these two things at the same time. Like, wow, like that's a huge building you drew. And it looks like there's so much going on there. Do you want to tell me more about it? This seems like a really scary thing, right? This was a really scary time. And, can you tell me about this person up here, right? Is there somebody in this picture who's trying to help? What are they doing? Can you tell me more about them? And so I can work with children from both of these angles. Also, if we're watching, maybe we're watching news with children, or maybe we're remembering something that happened to our family, right? So we can share these kind of lenses on things with children, and it can help them just broaden their perspective, particularly if it's focused on the anxiety of the situation. We can honor the anxiety of the situation and help them look for the helpers more actively. One other thing that we can be aware of with children, or that we can help children have a lens on, and this is because one of the things that makes trauma kind of stickier, particularly, is if we feel like we were powerless in a situation, right? And some folks really were powerless in a lot of ways. There's lots of things that were not controllable, right? And there's a big sense of helplessness. And so this is one of the things that can make trauma stickier. One thing that can help with children is if you can help them identify what's one thing that I did that helped. And it could be the smallest of things. It could be like, hey, do you remember when you tied your shoes, right? When you tied your shoes so that we could get in the car. That was helpful, right? Do you remember holding my hand, right? Because I was feeling scared, you were feeling scared, and that was helpful too. Right. So we don't want to take away feelings from children. They may really have felt powerless, and us as well. And we can also just help them have two sides to the story that they tell themselves about their own experience. Right. So what's one little thing maybe that I did that was helpful in that situation? So that's what I have to say about helping children who've experienced trauma and scary things. And I think I'm going to turn it over to, first I'll just mention there's a few books, and then I'll turn it over to Catherine for some more specifics about resources in the area and that conference or whatever it is that's coming up. So just a few books that I've found helpful when working with children who maybe have high anxiety in general, or particularly after something challenging or scary has happened, is a book called Please Explain Anxiety to Me. All of these resources, by the way, are in the handout. So it's up on the website. I'll drop it in the chat while Catherine is talking and doing her thing. So you can download it right from there. But all of the books, the titles, you don't have to make notes right now. They'll all be in the resources. I love Please Explain Anxiety to Me. It goes into a little bit of detail about how our brains work with children, but it talks about it using dinosaurs and that sort of thing. And it uses some of the big words about how our brains work. So I do really like that one. There's another great book called A Terrible Thing Happened. And this is a book about a little raccoon who, a terrible thing happened with his little raccoon. Sherman Smith saw the most terrible thing. He was very upset. It really scared Sherman to see such a terrible thing. And then it goes through, Sherman feels afraid. He starts getting angry and aggressive with other children. He starts having trouble eating. He wanted to sing louder and louder. He had stomach aches, all these kinds of things. And then he's having really a hard time because he's in sticky fight, flight, or freeze, right? And then he gets in trouble at school, and then he goes in and he finds somebody to talk to, and he learns to talk more about his feelings and that sort of thing. So that's a wonderful book. I really appreciate that one. We talked about why zebras don't get ulcers. And then there's lots of books like this that are workbooks. Oh, maybe Rachel can just help us mute. But there's lots of books like this, like workbooks that help folks who've experienced trauma, and some of them are paired to different demographics at different ages or that sort of thing. And workbooks can be really wonderful ways of just kind of having one thing to focus on at a time, keeping track of different things. Some of them are a little bit like guided journals. So those are some of my favorite resources. You may have other ideas as well, and you're welcome to drop them in the chat. there's resources that are just kind of natural resources. So just continuing to check in with friends and family, right? Stirring the pot can take a lot longer than anybody wants it to. And along the way, you know, are there things that people and places and connecting, just any kind of connecting can be helpful to kind of help the lizard brain become less sticky. Groups, different recreation things, going for walks. There's all different kinds of counseling services, and I'll let Catherine talk a little bit about some of the options. One thing I would just point out is, as someone who does offer counseling, is that there's talk therapy, and that's kind of what people classically think of as therapy, right? You go in, you talk about your feelings, you talk about your relationship with your mother, whatever it is, and that can be helpful and powerful to some people. And then the other thing I like to pay attention to is some people are like, I don't want to talk about this, right? This was something I don't want to kind of relive. I don't know what to say, whatever reason people have. I don't know who you are. Why would I want to tell you my story? Whatever it is, right? Some people don't like the talk therapy type things. There's other kinds of therapy that can be just as helpful, if not more helpful, for trauma. So things like art therapy, play therapy, particularly for children. There's something called somatic therapy, which is just a little bit like what we were doing with the tapping. It's paying attention to nervous system energy in the body. And how does our body hold trauma, and how does it release trauma, right? So there are different ways that you can access counseling as well, and it doesn't have to be you sitting there and talking to someone. So explore different ways if it's something that you might be interested in. Catherine, this is a lot of text, but again, it's all in the document that I'm going to drop in the chat. But Catherine, what would you like to say about all of these links?
Sure. So I've done a little bit of research in terms of what resources are available. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I'll say that there's so much available to our community, probably so much that it may feel overwhelming. But I just wanted to kind of walk people through a few things. The first one on the left is the Jewish Family Services Counseling. That is absolutely amazing. They're offering 10 sessions at $100 each. So the counselors sign up, and if you already have a therapist, there's a way for them to also get into the program. So it's nice from that perspective as well. In the handout that you get, if you click on that Google document, you can see all the providers that are currently in there. What's really great is that they have a notes section. So they'll say things like somatic therapy or EMDR, and if you have no idea what you want, you can actually call that number and they can help you find a therapist and match you. And the people at that program are absolutely amazing, really, really amazing people. So that's a great resource. No, it's covered. So you're basically getting $1,000 worth of therapy covered, and that's coming from the Wildfire Fund. So a lot of times you hear, we're raising money, it's going to the Wildfire Fund. One of the grants was to Jewish Family Services, and they have put together this crisis counseling program, but it's completely free of charge. And then I think the slide went down, but I can just talk because I have it up on the handout as well. United
I'll put it back up. Sorry, Catherine. I did drop the document in the chat. So it is up on our website, but I also just put it in the chat right now for everyone to have, and you can look at it while Catherine's talking too.
Great. And then United Policyholders, they also got a grant from the Wildfire Fund. They are doing, so I'm going to skip around a bit. So the Survivor to Survivor Forum, which is over on the right-hand side, that is put on by United Policyholders. That's the uphelp.org. They are an amazing resource. They help people basically navigate all of the stuff to do with insurance, whether you lost your home and you're dealing with, are they going to pay out the full amount of contents? Are they going to cover the demolition of the lot, right? All the different things like that. They also have a whole bunch of, how to speak the language of insurance. They have all different live events. The one I posted here, it's coming up March 15th. It's the next one they have. It's a Survivor to Survivor forum. And so it's really people who have been through wildfires in California, for example. And it's just a small forum where people can get together and talk to other people who have been through similar events. So that's an online way of just connecting with people who've had a similar experience. So less formal in terms of the counseling. Let me jump up the mental health support through mental health partners. I don't know, I haven't interacted with them, so I'm not exactly sure how many sessions they are offering, but that's another way to get counseling. So you can call that number and get more information. I actually don't have a lot of information on that. The Let's Talk Colorado is a general one. You can go in there. I think they actually do some texting support, if I remember correctly. That may be good for teens who I think, all they want to do is text, right? So you can help get help to them as well. And then I put in the Boulder County down the bottom. There's just so many resources through Boulder County of other things. There's some more that I've seen popping up that came up kind of after we finalized the slide. Town of Superior is doing some art therapy. There's some other things along those lines as well. So if you have questions about that, you're welcome to email me. I think we can get my email up on that website as well. I can help you connect to that. Or if you've seen on Facebook, you can find me on Facebook and friend me and send me a message. But I'm really happy to connect you. I will say I have just reached out to neighbors and said, let's get coffee, let's talk. And that's probably the best thing I've done. And then checking in on chat with people. Don't ask a binary question. That's not a good way to start a conversation. Say, how are you today? Right? Or something like that. I wanted to check in. I've been thinking about you. I wanted to see how you're doing today. And then that just starts a conversation. And I probably have 12 chats that I have going on with different people who are in different situations. And we're just sort of checking in on each other. And there are days when I'm like, it's a hard day. I hate this, right? And someone else, she'll write back, I hate this too. And it's okay, right? So that is a really, really powerful way to connect. And if you'd like to grab coffee with me, I have to go back to work week after next. But this next week, I'm still off work because I'm working through my own trauma related to this and other things. Happy to connect in person.
Awesome, Catherine. Thank you so much. So what I will offer is that, Catherine, I'll connect with you again after we're kind of wrapped up here, and we'll make sure we have all of the resources that we want to be in the final document. And then I'll just send it out in a blast email to everyone as well.
Okay.
If you had any trouble getting our emails, just double check your junk folder, but then you can also always send us an email. I'll just email you directly with this final document. But yeah, we'll get it out there. Okay, let's just do a final review. So these are the things, kind of key points that we chatted about. So lizard brain takes over to protect us, right? Our brains are our good friends, and they're always doing the best they can to help us with difficult situations. So lizard brain is trying to protect us, but because it's an unconscious part of the brain, it doesn't always make sense when we look back at it in terms of how it's sticking around. Trauma, exposure to a traumatic event, can result in what we might think of as being in a sticky fight, flight, or freeze state. So in a continuously traumatized state, and this could be a little bit, this could be a lot. And like we did that little bit of repeat after me, right? This is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. My brain's doing the best it can to protect me in this abnormal situation. Healing can take longer than anybody wants it to. Right? Keep stirring that pot. Keep stirring the pot of healing. And there are some things that you can do along the way. Rhythmic, repetitive, and relational activities are naturally regulating for the part of our brain that experiences trauma, and they naturally help to release some of the stickiness of that fight, flight, freeze. So keep it up with keep throwing your socks around. Right? Play is the natural healing language of children. We can encourage play. We can see it as a positive thing for children. We can give them opportunities to play. We can help children look for the helpers. We can help ourselves look for the helpers, right? And it doesn't mean that it wasn't a horrible experience, because two things can be true at the same time, right? But we can also help ourselves look for the helpers and help children look for the helpers. And like Catherine was just talking about, right? Connection is the correction. So continue to connect with each other, continue to check in with other people, reach out, access recreational groups, or any kind of connection to community or to other humans can also be very helpful. So, with that in mind, I'm very glad that you all came here to connect. That's really, really a positive step as well. You're welcome to drop in the chat And Catherine and I talked about, sometimes this can feel overwhelming, like even that just little review slide, that's a lot of information. The document that I sent out has all of kind of the key points from everything that we talked about today, partly because it might be helpful to go through and read it. But I'm also aware that that can be overwhelming, like, a 5-page document of typed notes. My goodness, what are you offering me here today? This is too much, right? And so that's okay too. If it feels overwhelming, just focus on one thing at a time. So you're welcome to drop in the chat. What's one next step that you're going to take? What's one maybe thing that you pulled from this time that we had together today that might have been helpful? What's one thing? You're welcome to drop that in the chat. And I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment. Oh yeah, big party on New Year's Eve for a year and a day. Yeah.
Watching Canto again made me laugh.
Watching Canto again.
I just saw just today, it was, those signs like, we've made it this many days since doing, anyway, I just saw one that a teacher made that I had, we've made it this many days since singing. We don't
talk about Bruno.
How can I even forget that? We don't talk about Bruno. And it was just like a big 0.
Yeah. Oh, we could wrap up with a little we could all sing We Don't Talk About Bruno together. No, I'm just kidding. I'll let you do that on your own if you want to. So let's just take a nice big stretch up. Nice deep breath. Being online less and more tapping and exercise. Yeah, I like that. Pay attention to where there's a little bit of tension in your body and see if there's one little thing that you might do to help it just be a little bit less tense than it was before. Keep stirring that pot. Anything else you want to say before we invite folks to leave if they would like, Catherine?
I just want to thank you again for doing this. I had the idea that I wanted to do something to help, but I'm not qualified, nor could I pull this off. But that's why I create a circle of healers around me and people who care. And so Daye and Rachel have entered into my circle of healers and people who can help the world. So thank you.
Awesome.
From all of us.
Yeah, very, very welcome. And that connection is the correction. It's so great to connect with all of you. Please be in touch if you ever would like to. I'm going to stick around for a few minutes if folks have questions or want to chat, but have a great rest of your Sunday afternoon, evening.
Thank you,
everyone.